Hi and welcome to Crime Time UK. If you like this video, please give it a like, and if you'd like to support the channel, please subscribe.
On the 7th of June 1992, the mutilated body of 18-year-old hairdresser Katie Radcliffe was found here in Farnborough, Hampshire. She had been brutally stabbed to death.
Due to the ferocity of the murder, the police were certain they were looking for a male killer. But in fact, Katie's attacker was a 12-year-old girl named Sharon Carr. It would be 4 years before she was brought to justice, in which time she'd attempt to claim another teenage victim. I've been working with children for over 25 years, and in that time, I've been invited into hundreds of family homes around the world. I understand the complex human nature of children, their behaviour and healthy, functional family life. And for me, the words evil and children just don't sit well together. How can someone so young commit, follow through, and execute such a monstrous act?
And in this case, how does a 12-year-old girl become a sadistic killer?
It was a horrifying case, and not least because the diary entries were read out, which revealed in quite some detail that Carr enjoyed the act of murder and had celebrated it thereafter.
In March 1997, Sharon Carr was sentenced to 14 years behind bars for killing Katie Radcliffe. She is the youngest female murderer in British history.
Passing sentence, Mr. Justice Scott Baker told Carr, "It is clear that killing, in your words, turns you on. You are a very dangerous young woman." As Sharon Carr left the dock, she was smiling. She may spend the rest of her life behind bars.
Crime reporter Paul Cheston was working for the Evening Standard during the 1990s. When did you first hear about Sharon Carr?
Well, I worked in London at that time, and when I found out that Katie Radcliffe had been murdered, it was a ghastly and gruesome crime. Girls who kill girls is very unusual indeed.
Right.
Girls who kill strangers, even more unusual.
Right.
And a 12-year-old girl to kill an 18-year-old, a child to kill an adult who they'd never met before, is unique is the only word.
At 12 years old, most girls are listening to music and hanging out with friends. But in 1992, Sharon Carr's life was very different, with reports of her drug abuse and violent behaviour. So did her upbringing shape her, or was Sharon Carr born with a killer instinct?
Sharon was born in the former colony of British Honduras, now known as Belize, in 1979. Her life in the Central American country was far from perfect.
She was born into what we regard as a sort of poverty-stricken environment, very modest home. But I think what became clear was that she had a dysfunctional childhood.
Her father was a violent drunk. Her mother was explosive with her temper and also was someone who was callous. This meant that Sharon will have gone through some fairly horrendous experiences.
It's a child's rite of passage to be nurtured, loved, given guidance, to be protected by your guardians, your parents. None of this
There's absolutely
existed.
none of that whatsoever. It was chaos, it was upheaval. I think it was the case of survival for this young girl.
Sharon's mother met an Englishman, and the family left Belize and relocated to the town of Camberley in Surrey.
It was an opportunity to escape, shall we say, a more poverty sort of stricken environment to live in the West, and initially, it seems, things went well.
She started at school as a promising student. I mean, one teacher described her as charming and refreshing. She played in the basketball team, and suddenly it all seemed to change as she grew up. Far from being this promising student, she became aggressive in class.
When she moved across to the UK, this was a kind of privileged position, but she was uncomfortable with this. She would have trouble in settling to a life where things were given to others, where other people seemed to have everything, and she, from her past, had nothing. This inborn inferiority would lead to her feeling resentment.
Even at a young age, Carr began to smoke cannabis around the old Dean estate where she grew up.
Certainly we know that Sharon Carr was experimenting with cannabis. What kind of effect would that have on the developing brain?
Well, we know that use of cannabis in the very young is a real risk factor for later psychosis. Why that's the case is being unpicked at the moment, but clearly that's increasing her risk for this schizophrenia.
Sharon took these drugs at a fairly formative age, only 11 years old. It would have introduced her to a subculture, the kind of have-nots, bonding together in drugs and violence, in crime.
She's had very little control over her life as a child, and I think when we look at her drug taking, that's an attempt to take back some control. We often see addiction as a symptom of something like that. So she's internalizing at this point in time. She's turning it in on herself.
Sharon's mother split with her new husband and was reportedly a fiery character.
I think it was sort of evident quite quickly that her mother was a volatile personality herself, and things went on that the young Sharon Carr saw that may have, affected her own personality. After the marriage sort of ended, and there was quite a violent episode, we were told by the stepfather that when he sort of finally went to see Sharon Carr's mother to say, I'm finished, this relationship's over, that she poured boiling fat over him, and he was in agony. Her stepfather said one of the most extraordinary things about that incident was the calm face of Sharon Carr. She witnessed it and didn't flinch. She was absorbing these images of violence, and it didn't appear to disturb her.
The brain hasn't even developed a sensitivity to any of this because you're just neutralized from anything that we would see as violent and aggressive.
Yeah, she's not horrified by it, she's not disgusted by it. It doesn't make her want to go and run away. If anything, it's something that she comes to expect.
It's her normal.
Happen. It's her normal. It really is.
Sharon Carr, his mother, was, I would say obsessed, but she was part of the voodoo culture, and Sharon Carr grew up with a belief that this had power and that it could affect her life.
She will have picked up these superstitious behaviour, rituals, the idea that she could have gained power over others by performing these rituals, by actually slaughtering animals. This obviously got through to Sharon because she did carry out some pretty horrific acts on animals.
You instantly worry. That's not normative behaviour, and is a classic worrying sign if a child is harming animals.
Pets would start going missing. A next-door neighbour's pet was found decapitated. It was never proved, but I mean, the prime suspect was Sharon Carr. There was a fear of her. She cast a spell over people. I don't mean that in a voodoo sense, but her aura was that people were afraid of her. Don't go near here.
Clearly, she's grown up seeing violence
Yes.
be the norm or be almost enjoyed, but she's also reveling in violence herself.
Sharon may have been young, but she was feared by her neighbours.
She didn't have the type of parental control which you'd expect a child of that age to have. She was able to roam free, and she was an intimidating character. People were scared of her. She had a reputation.
When I look at young children that have never been given the correct guidance, the love, the nurturing, where boundaries haven't been put in place, what I see in front of me is the body of a young child that's lost all of its innocence. And that's what I think about when we talk about Sharon Carr.
She's had to adapt to survive in her environment, so she's not had any of those normal childhood experiences, those experiences of being able to do things and knowing that, mum or dad are there to pick you up off the floor or to comfort you afterwards. There's just none of that. I think she learnt from a very young age that she'd have to stand on her own 2 feet and she'd have to be incredibly tough to survive in that kind of environment.
I believe voodoo gave her a sort of sense of herself being bulletproof. Right. That she ran amok. We know that she carried weapons in a satchel in her school years, and she had a sort of kudos on the estate, which is a tough estate.
By June 1992, at the age of 12, Sharon progressed from animals to humans. Her unsuspecting victim was 18-year-old hairdresser Katie Ratcliffe.
This was a frenzied attack. This was a very violent attack. This was an attack which went way beyond the needs of killing someone. This was meant to inflict harm. Sharon was out for obliteration.
In June 1992, 12-year-old Sharon Carr had built a terrifying reputation on the old Dean estate.
I mean, people were scared.
They were. So this girl arrives and she's causing absolute chaos. People are afraid of her. So she's arrived in this new environment. She's kind of aware that her behaviour is something that is not okay. But she's not going to stop doing it. It's so entrenched at this point in time.
In nearby Hawley, 18-year-old hairdresser Katie Ratcliffe was in the early stages of a blossoming career.
What do you know about Katie?
Katie was like a complete antithesis of Sharon Carr. At 18, she had loads of friends. She was a bubbly person. She was a hairdresser. Every prospect of going up to possibly run her own business, married children, great career. All these things were in front of her.
We reached out to over 50 people involved with this case, many of them Katie's friends and colleagues, but none would appear on camera. Some 25 years later, they are still too devastated to talk about her murder.
Sharon Carr has cast a shadow over Camberley, over the estate she lived in. Those who knew her still think of her as that out-of-control 12-year-old young teenager, even though she is now locked away with the very rare prospect that she's ever going to be released. They still have that image of her and a fear of her and what she did and what she stood for.
When you look at Sharon Carr's case, it's absolutely haunting and chilling. No one wanted to talk about it.
It's incredible, isn't it? You think all these years later that fear is still very much there. This individual infiltrated this community, struck fear into everybody around her. And even though she is now behind bars, behind some very tall walls of an institution, she's still having an impact on people. Yes. It's something that I've never come across before, actually, of this magnitude, this long after the event.
Katie's former boss at the salon where she worked, Alison Moore, told us,
Kate wasn't a member of staff. She was part of our family. This terrible event deprived Kate of her future, just as she was beginning to blossom into a young hairdresser. To this day, we talk of Kate, we think of her, we remember the fun and happy times we had together, and now we smile.
On June the 6th, 1992, Katie and her best friend went out to a nightclub in Camberley called Ragamuffins. Katie would never make it home.
Boyfriend at that time had decided that they'd split up. So little things that we now know would blow over at that time would have been weighing on her mind, and this was one of the reasons why she wanted to go out that night.
After the club closed, at some stage during the early hours, Katie crossed paths with a 12-year-old girl called Sharon Carr.
What happened next? The police have their own theory. Along comes a car. She has to get from there to Farnborough. It had to be a car.
Yeah.
She gets into a car, whether she's hitching a lift or she actually knows those inside. We have to assume that Carr was inside the car. The two girls had never met before. They were complete strangers. No connection at all.
Mm-hmm.
So who was driving the car? Not a 12-year-old girl.
Mm-hmm.
It had to be one, possibly two men in the car. The next thing was that 3 miles away in Farnborough at 7 a.m. the next morning, so 5-hour gap, her half-naked body stabbed so viciously, so savagely, it can only be described as a frenzy. 27 odd stab and slash wounds to various parts of her body, head, shoulders, heart, liver, genitalia.
It was almost a Jack the Ripper sort of incident. We know what we feel about how barbaric that was, but this was a situation where the lady's sexual organs were attacked. Some of the injuries from the pathologist suggest that she was actually dead. One can only, in fear, think of how this young girl must have thought at the start of the attack and how it must have just carried on.
Her parents were obviously devastated, and inquiries focused on the nightclub where Katie had been the night of her murder. It was Hampshire police who dealt with the investigation. It was a very thorough investigation, but nothing had suggested that a girl could have carried out this most horrific of murders. You just don't associate that with a woman, let alone with a child aged just 12. It's unthinkable.
And a 12-year-old killing an 18-year-old, a 12-year-old killing an adult.
It's incredible, isn't it? Because we often think of children as vulnerable, as in need of our love and our care and our protection. So when we see a case like Sharon Carr's, it turns that on its head. So we've gone from a child as a victim to a child as an aggressor.
The police tried in vain to find Katie's killer. Criminal profilers were brought in to try and help catch the murderer.
For the investigating police, Katie's death was one of mystery. However, the primary evidence, the frenzied attack, the sexuality of the attack, would point to a male. It would point to perhaps a male in their 30s. It would point to someone who was physically capable of dragging Katie from the one killing location to her final resting place.
I think that the mystical character Sherlock Holmes said, if you rule out what's impossible, everything else is possible, however improbable it may seem. So I don't think a mistake, but they tended to believe this was an adult male and this was quite a severe sexual attack. I think now you would take that on board, definitely, but you would still allow your mind to consider other possibilities.
When we see women kill, we see them use generally just enough violence to get the job done. They won't use something called overkill. They won't stab somebody time after time after time. They won't, mutilate their body in the way that Sharon mutilated Katie. Sharon Carr is enjoying the process of killing somebody. She's enjoying taking the life from them, of mutilating their body, because this is the point at which, and perhaps the only point at which, she is completely in control, and that's what she's seeking.
Sharon Carr was reveling in the enjoyment of killing for the first time. Her diaries that were discovered at a later date revealed the euphoric sensation it had given her.
There were diary entries referring to KR, Katie Ratcliffe's initials obviously, in which she basically boasted about her involvement in the killing. She actually relished it. What had happened really revealed her sort of lust for blood, not an ounce of sympathy at all. She was enjoying the memory of what she had inflicted on Katie Ratcliffe. And there are other diary entries as well, which she had made, in which I think she referred to killing being her business, and business being good.
She wrote about how in her dreams every night she saw the devil, and I realise that it is me. And she said, described herself as a life destroyer, a twisted life destroyer.
The reveling in violence is really troubling, and it does make you feel that there is somebody who really lacks all remorse, and in that sense does show psychopathic traits.
These were damning. These were, if you like, a reiteration of the enjoyment she felt about killing Katie, the sexual intensity of Sharon's feelings at the time of the killing, the idea that she enjoyed seeing the fear on the face of her victim and the life draining from them. This was something that Sharon wanted to revisit. It was something that she was proud of. It was something, if you like, that she wanted the world to know about, but she couldn't tell them.
The diary entries don't suggest that Sharon was troubled over the murder. Quite the opposite, in fact. So is this the real Sharon Carr? Or a separate personality grown out of an undiagnosed mental health problem?
It wasn't until years later, after her arrest, that doctors were able to study Sharon's behaviour.
Sharon Carr was diagnosed with having schizoaffective disorder. Can you please explain to me what that is?
So schizoaffective disorder is the combination of schizophrenia, a psychosis, and a mood disorder. So affective means the mood disorder. So along with delusions, paranoia, hallucinations that we associate with schizophrenia, you have either depression or mania and depression, as in bipolar disorder. So the combination of those things.
Sharon continued to write her diary for the next 2 years.
As the years ticked by and Katie's killer was never found, Sharon would have gained in confidence. She would have began to think that she couldn't be caught, that she was immune, if you like. She'd carried out murder and got away with it. The idea of attacking another girl was certainly on the cards. It was something where she needed the reality of having power over another person to put them in fear and watch them as they die.
On June the 7th, 1994, exactly 2 years after killing Katie Ratcliffe, Sharon Carr was ready to strike again. "12-year-old Sharon Carr had got away with murder in 1992. But 2 years on, and now age 14, according to her diaries, she was becoming desperate to feel the sensation of killing another human once more.
Well, the diaries are a way of basically reliving the murders. It's a way of commemorating them. It's being able to go back and to revisit that moment when she felt all-powerful. So she's preserving that moment. She doesn't want to forget it. And that's why we see these quite lengthy passages written about the most horrendous acts of violence, because she wants to enjoy it. She wants to get that high again.
In 1994, on what turned out to be the second anniversary of Katie's murder, a female pupil at a comprehensive school in Camberley was stabbed almost fatally in the school toilets. Carr had lured her into the toilet, supposedly on the pretext that she had lost a £1 coin and wanted some help. Carr had a reputation in the school. The girl didn't think it was a wise idea to say, no, I'm not going to help you find your £1 coin. And she was stabbed in the lungs. I think it was a 4-inch knife. And she was very lucky to survive. Had 4 or 5 pupils not gone into the toilet at the time when Carl just stabbed her, she probably would have died.
Sharon's attack on Anne-Marie Clifford happened on June the 7th, 1994, 2 years after the murder of Katie. The significance of the date surely can't be written off as coincidence.
Well, it was exactly 2 years to the day that Katie was murdered. So there is that sense of the ritualistic, isn't there, here?
Like celebrating?
Well, it could well be. And this idea of recreating something, of revisiting something, the idea of the anniversary, but the anniversary of the most horrendous thing.
This time, there would be no escape for Sharon. She had been caught red-handed. Journalist Stephen Wright interviewed Anne-Marie Clifford about the life-threatening attack in March 1997.
She said very clearly that she looked up and Carr was standing over her with the knife, sort of juggling it from one hand to another. And she was smiling. And it's a very sort of chilling image. Someone who's possibly on the brink of murdering someone, smiling, enjoying the terror that she had inflicted on her victim.
She's lured her in with the intention of harming her. She's enjoying absolutely every minute of this. And if anything, I think she is trying to get back to that point, recreate that moment when she felt all-powerful when she killed Katie.
I have to say, I think that could have been another murder in the making. I think that had those 5 female students not entered the toilet when they did, then we can assume that maybe the worst would have happened.
Sharon was found guilty of 2 counts of actual bodily harm against 13-year-old Anne-Marie Clifford and sentenced to 2 years at Bulwood Hall Young Offenders Institute.
Annie was deeply traumatised, as you would expect. She had nightmares and had difficulty sleeping. I think her father may have slept with the end of the bed for a time. She had a very loving family who supported her through it. But I guess she had that fear that Carr would somehow get out of the custody unit where she was staying and come after her again. And she had seen for herself what Carr was capable of.
It was in the Young Offenders Institute in the spring of 1996 when Sharon Carr, now aged 16, finally admitted the truth about what had happened to Katie Ratcliffe 4 years earlier.
So she ended up then sentenced to a Young Offenders Institute, Bulwood Hall in Essex, and confided that she had killed Katie Ratcliffe.
I think it was a prison officer, and I think it was other people that she was bragging to, other prisoners, in fact, as well. In fact, she seemed to be quite open with what she'd done, and almost as a badge of honour. The police would be called in. There would have been discussions with medical people. What is the best way to approach and the best way to retrieve that evidence? And then they did what they did, conducting the interview, which was quite a lengthy interview in the end, where it seems to me that it was almost an outpouring of, this is what I've done.
She also revealed things which nobody else in the public could possibly have known. The police had kept back certain facts. The fact that a bracelet was stolen from Katie. Carr knew that, nobody else did. Right. And the description of some of the injuries, again, couldn't be released at the time. They were such a And Carr knew all about that as well. And they then found the crucial evidence of Sharon Carr's diaries.
After Carr boasted of the murder, the police were informed. They searched the house on the old Dean estate where Carr had lived with her mother. It was there they found the diaries.
It's not usual to get as graphic evidence as that, and I think based on what a confession, that was evidence which allows you to think, actually, not only has the person said it, but prior to saying it, they've been writing it, because those notes went back a number of months and years. So it's not just someone who's dreamt up today, I'm going to tell you this story. And that is excellent evidence to be able to say, you are the person that has committed this offence.
Then it dawned on them that far from it being a man in his 30s who'd done this, it was a girl aged 12.
In total, Sharon gave detectives 3 different versions of what had happened on the night Katie was murdered. In all 3, she told the police that she had stabbed Katie to death.
I know from some of the evidence that Sharon gave to the police officers that she was almost talking about this victim begging and how she kept going. So it's one which I think has scarred many people, family and friends of this young lady. My heart goes out to them.
2 men, believed to be in the car with Sharon and Katie, were questioned by police and provided each other with an alibi. But questions still remain.
You're thinking, can a 12-year-old girl drag an 18-year-old, 8.5 stone, she's not an elfin. That would have taken some dragging.
My opinion around that particular part of the evidence of the boys that were in the car is, my guess is that the police do know what happened, but they haven't been able to get the evidence that could be put before a court that, beyond reasonable doubt. So that's what my guess is. So I guess that's a frustrating part of this investigation. Not being able to maybe prove beyond reasonable doubt exactly what happened and having that nagging doubt. Is that right? Is that wrong? Is that right? Is that wrong? I've always found that a frustrating part of policing.
In May 1996, after 27 hours of police interviews, Sharon was charged with Katie's murder. Only weeks later, on June the 7th, her diary simply read, "Respect to Katie Radcliffe, 4 years today."
Can you explain to me how you felt when you first saw that this case was around a 12-year-old girl?
But it came as a great shock. Can it really have happened, like this, that a girl who was only 12 at the time could be charged with murder of an older person? So yes, professionally, the first thought was, this is an extraordinarily big story. If found guilty, this is a serious part of history which may never be equalled.
However, while in custody, Sharon retracted her confession.
What had happened was that 2 months after the police interview, she, in so much, said, it wasn't me, I'm not guilty, and it was down to her legal team to force the prosecution to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt in the eyes of the jury. It was a negative but not unusual defence tactic.
Sharon's historic trial was set for March 1997. If found guilty, she would become Britain's youngest ever female murderer. In March 1997, 17-year-old Sharon Carr was finally on trial for the murder of Katie Radcliffe. Sharon had brutally killed the trainee hairdresser in June 1992 when she was just 12. The jury would have to decide whether Carr was guilty of murder or the lesser charge of manslaughter.
The trial kicked off at Winchester Crown Court. I was there for the opening of the case. And I remember thinking that this is unprecedented. If she is convicted of this murder, she is the youngest murderess in British criminal history.
You remember the first time you saw Sharon Carr?
Absolutely, yes. I was staggered when she came into court. Very squat, very square-shouldered, short hair. Tomboy hardly catches it. She wore a white polo neck and a gold crucifix down the side, and she looked as if she'd arrived for her first mass or her first communion. It was whether this was a case of trying to say, you know, I'm butter wouldn't melt in my mouth. If she did, if that was the plan, it didn't work.
Over the course of the 4-week trial, the jury heard verbal and written confessions from Sharon. And although there was no forensic evidence, she knew details of the murder that only the killer could have known.
As the trial went on, it was much more of the Sharon Carr which came out in the police interviews. It was a cold and no trace of any remorse or anything like that. I mean, whatever emotion she'd shown earlier could well have been, it was really on reaction to her own situation, her own plight,
Yes.
sitting there in a dock, rather than any empathy for what she had done or to the victim and her family.
Sharon's fate lay in the hands of the jury.
The trial, the environment, the atmosphere, the energy, I mean, that must have, in itself, been quite suffocating.
The jury was shown the Carr's diaries, and this was new to them completely, and just what she wrote and the imagery, and everything, that was a clinching moment, and there was a certain stretching back of thinking, oh, blimey, couldn't possibly have expected this. And to think a 12-year-old could do this, there was almost a visible inhaling of breath at the shocking nature of those diaries.
I was thinking, well, the jury are going to have to get their head around the idea here, whatever the evidence is, that this young girl in the dock could have done such a horrendous act. It was a difficult case for the jury. Can a 12-year-old really be responsible for stabbing a girl 29 times and mutilating her?
However shocked and appalled they may have been, the jury had reached a decision. The evidence against Sharon was just too overwhelming.
It was a unanimous verdict, 7 men, 5 women. And when they said the word guilty, Helen and Joe Ratcliffe, they didn't let out hoops of joy, but the sense of relief and the gasp and the tears, it was, entirely understandable. Parents of a dead child, want to see, almost as if a vindication for their daughter is that the person they believe committed that crime was found guilty of murder, not a lesser charge.
The jury agreed that Sharon Carr was responsible for her actions, as she was found guilty of murder, not manslaughter. Sharon was sentenced to 14 years in prison, but the judge, Mr. Justice Scott Baker, recommended that she should be detained indefinitely.
She is in that category of really, really dangerous psychopathic murderer, where there's no way that the public can be safe, whatever age, really, she would come out of custody.
Is there rehabilitation for somebody like Sharon Carr?
In her case, I have severe reservations. And I don't know of any success of a case like that. And all the thousands I've dealt with, I don't know. The prognosis is poor.
Well, you would have to question, even if there were, you would then be putting Sharon Carr back into society and then an environment that already has fostered the dysfunction in the first place.
You're absolutely right. And it is depressing to think about that. What is more depressing for me is to think about when she was 11, 12, 13 or 14 and what could have been done. But what we damn well ought to be doing, or should have done in her case, is to look at what the local authorities, agencies did and what they did not do.
This young child, surrounded by violence, abuse, aggression. She never stood a chance, did she?
I don't think so. I think this is one of those cases where absolutely everything is there. If you were to write a recipe for making a murderer, list the ingredients, list what you need to do to create the right mix, then you've got all of it here. It really is tragic.
I think there is a duty, and I think Parliament might need to revisit this to see, isn't this something that we ought to be looking at? To see, could these offences have been committed? Lessons have to be learned. And failing to learn those lessons is an outrage, really. And I can't understand it.
So, in the case of Sharon Carr, nature or nurture?
Her diagnosis is so complicated because as well as this schizoaffective label, she also has multiple borderline, antisocial personality disorder, a whole lot of descriptions. She's clearly a very, very troubled young woman from a very difficult upbringing, so it's hard to disentangle what's what.
Sharon Carr was sentenced in 1997. She is still serving time in a secure hospital.
I cannot believe that there's any parole board or any mental health tribunal examining her record that could ever consider that she would be fit for release and that the public would never be in danger from her again.
Yes.
Sharon Carr remains Britain's youngest ever female murderer. And I have to say, I don't expect that record to be beaten at any time. It is a shocking indictment of humanity that a 12-year-old could inflict such a savage, frenzied attack on a complete stranger.
She may have had mental health problems, but she was pure evil as well. And that's why the public has to be protected from her. And in my opinion, she should never be released.
There can be no argument that Sharon Carr's childhood was extremely traumatic, with frequent exposure to violence, drugs, and domestic dysfunction. All these elements would have affected her greatly. But not all kids from a troubled upbringing end up as murderers. So what makes her so different?
From what I've learnt, Sharon had some major mental health problems and a very dysfunctional, abusive childhood. However, there can be no excuse for carrying out such a vicious attack and a brutal murder. Her diaries prove that she clearly enjoyed the killing. It gave Sharon a thrill. Can someone capable of such violence ever be rehabilitated?